Welcome, friends. You're listening to Conversations with Consequences, the radio show and podcast of the Catholic Association, where you get witty and charming conversation about the topics that matter to you with the leading thinkers of our time. I'm your hostess, Dr. Gracie Christie, and I'm in our DC studio today, and I'm joined in studio by my colleague and good friend, our legal eagle at the Catholic Association, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer. Hello, Andrea.
Hi, Gracie. It is so great to have you back up here with us.
Oh, well, I love DC.
I was so grateful that I had a chance to drive you around the greater DC area, having been lost by Waze several times.
Yes, we got lost several times
in the studio.
But thankfully, we got here just ahead of our very distinguished guests that we have with us today in the studio. But before I introduce them, I'd like to remind our listeners that if you're listening on the radio, you're listening at 11 a.m. on Fridays on the Guadalupe Radio Network in D.C. And if not, you're listening for free wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe. You can go to our webpage at thecatholicassociation.org/podcasts, and it will direct you to our free subscriptions. So today, Andrea, we have two very distinguished gentlemen joining us in studio. And the first gentleman is Dr. Tom Farr, who's the president of the Religious Freedom Institute, a nonprofit that works to advance religious freedom. He has a long and distinguished career. He served for 28 years in the U.S. Army and U.S. Foreign Service. In 1999, he became the first director of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom. He, among other things, he serves as a consultant to the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Committee on International Justice and Peace. Welcome, Dr. Farr.
Thanks, Gracie. Great to be here.
No, it's our pleasure. And he brought a friend with him, also from the Religious Freedom Institute, Ismail Royer. Hello, Ismail.
Hello.
Wait, let me introduce you. He is the director of the Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team for the Religious Freedom Institute. He converted to Islam in 1992, and he spent over a decade working at nonprofit Islamic organizations. And he's been widely published, and we are very fortunate to have him here with us today.
Thank you.
So the Religious Freedom Institute, to give a little background to our listeners, works to address religious freedom issues before multilateral institutions like the Organization of American States, in testimony to U.S. Congress, in briefs to the Supreme Court, and also in the State Department, if I'm not wrong about that. But why don't we let Dr. Farr. I think of you as Tom. I'm sorry. I keep messing up your title. Maybe I can
all
call
that
you
work
Tom.
to get a PhD.
No.
Maybe you can tell us about, you know what, actually, before we talk, if you don't mind, before we talk about the Religious Freedom Institute, maybe you could define for us religious freedom. Now, that maybe sounds a little bit basic, but perhaps people's idea of religious freedom has become a little cramped over the last few, decades.
Sure.
And maybe your expansive, much more true definition will help us to get started.
Right. Well, this isn't going to sound very sophisticated, but it is basic. Religious freedom is the right to believe or not. But if you believe, in order to carry out your beliefs, you have the right to be a member of a religious community, do the things that religious communities do the things that religious people do, worship, follow your conscience, and things like this. Sometimes this is pretty interior stuff, private stuff. It doesn't necessarily have public implications. So the second part of this definition is the right to take your religious beliefs in the public life of your country as a citizen. Not as an absolute right. You can't kill people because you think your religion tells you to do it, but you can and you must be a steward of your religious beliefs, at least in the American system, in public life. The founders set the system up, the free exercise of religion. That's a very, very useful and I think communicative phrase. Exercise your religion. That's not just, Pentecostals singing loud in church. They do that. So some Catholics do too. Not many.
We do in Miami.
Do they? Okay. Well,
I do, only if the organ plays very loudly.
have you ever read the book Why Catholics Can't Sing? We'll leave that out of this.
Oh, not in Miami.
The point is, it means taking what you believe out into the public square, into the life of your country as a citizen. That's the way the founders wanted it, and that's what we're not doing. We'll get into that.
Well, Tom, I was in preparation for our conversation today. I was looking through some of the great documents of Vatican II, and the Declaration on Religious Freedom has a really helpful definition for Catholics as well to understand the importance of religious freedom in our faith. And I'm just going to read from it because I thought it was brilliant. And the fathers of the council write, religious freedom has to do with immunity from coercion in civil society. Therefore, it leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies towards the true religion and towards the one Church of Christ. And there's kind of twofold in there, and I think what we're going to be speaking a lot about is the first part, and that's being free from coercion of civil society, and that deals with oftentimes the state, the formal state, and the culture in which people are living. And as we kind of delve deeper into our conversation today, we can talk about that twofold freedom from coercion, whether it's the formal government or the people that you're living, amongst.
That's right, Andrea. Thank you for that. And really, it's both parts of what you read from Dignitatis. Religious freedom itself is an immunity from coercion, but it's also freedom for the Church to make its claims. And what's revolutionary about and I mean that in a temporal sense, Dignitatis, it is a development of doctrine. It's not a turning over of doctrine. That's not what I mean. It's revolutionary in the sense that it's saying to all of us as Catholics that but every human being has a right to immunity from coercion by other human beings and by the state. What we have, and so we want to protect that for all human beings and all religious communities. It goes on to say, in effect, that what we demand for Catholics is libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the Church to make its claims publicly in society, claims about what justice is, claims about what a human being is, claims about what truth is, publicly, not just within our masses. But here's the real, in my view, revolutionary part of this. It says every other religious group in a given society has that right as well, and we as Catholics defend it. So an immunity from coercion does not mean syncretism or indifferentism. It doesn't mean that all religions are the same or that there are many ways to Christ. We don't believe that. That's our claim. Others get to make their claims too and enjoy the immunity from coercion. Things work better, and I'll just end with this point. I keep coming back to the founders. I think this is what they meant. They weren't Catholics, by the way. There weren't many Catholics involved in the construction of our First Amendment.
And it may be that their leanings were maybe anti-Catholic, no?
Some of them were very anti-Catholic. But I would say today, in my view, Catholics defend what the founders meant pretty well, and indeed, I would say better than most others. So immunity from coercion, the freedom of all religious groups and individuals, of course within limits. You didn't read this part, Andrea, but it goes on to say this is not an unlimited right. It can be limited by the demands of public order and public morality.
The more narrow and cramped definition of religious freedom that's become maybe more widespread in the United States and in other Western societies is what has been described freedom to worship, correct?
Correct.
And I tend to think that most people who aren't delving deeply into these things and don't go on your website and attend your great conferences might be thinking of it this way. Might be thinking that religious freedom means that you wake up on a Sunday or on a Saturday, depending on your day of worship, and you have the freedom to make your way down to your place of worship and worship behind closed doors. But the more important part of it, or the more expansive part of it that we started talking about, is that ability to exercise. So what does that exercise look like? Like what parts of society do you think that religious freedom as a human right allows human beings in a proper free society to exercise their freedom?
Well, the two are not really separate. They go together. You know, if you're going to exercise your religion, it usually does begin with worship. It begins with these interior things. It would be odd to be exercising religion if you never went to Mass or you never went to the synagogue or to mosque. Sure. So you do have these beliefs, and the obligations of conscience come out of these beliefs. But the point of the point you're making, if I understand it, Gracie, is that today many people want to stop with freedom of worship. And indeed, the prior administration made a big deal of this. That is to say, it's fine to do whatever you want to do behind your church walls or behind the walls of your house of worship. Just don't bring it out into the public. Everybody can support that. But not only is that contrary to Dignitatis Humanae, it's contrary to the American system. And we'll talk about, I'm sure in a few minutes, religious freedom doesn't work in all of its benefits if it doesn't give the right of religious individuals to go into the public lives of their countries as free and equal citizens. That's where you really get the temporal payoff of religious freedom. As Catholics, we want to talk quite rightly about salvation and souls, and we care about that. In addition to that, however, we want to be members of our societies.
For me as a physician, I find this very troubling, the lack of acceptance of bringing one's religious faith into public life. For me, public life might be what I'm doing now, but it's also my life as a doctor. And there's a lot of angry responses when I try to speak as a pro-life physician. And they say you're bringing religion into medicine, and that's an improper place.
Well, I know Ismail wants to jump in here, but let me just respond to that point. It's a very good one. The First Amendment has been turned on its head, Gracie, when they say that any citizen of this country, and it's not just Christians or Catholics, it's anybody else, cannot bring their religious beliefs into what they do for a living, into their politics, into their public lives as citizens. So whether you're a doctor or a veterinarian or a ditch digger, you have a right, and I would argue as a Christian, you have a responsibility to bring to all those around you.
Well, and for many of us in the faith, our work is sanctifying. We sanctify our work. We express our faith through everything we do, and it isn't limited to a priest or a religious. It's in the consultation room. It's in the courtroom. And it's living that coherency that I think is something that you can't detach from faith. Now, Ismail, you come from you're living a different faith tradition, and I wonder, I am very ignorant on many things, but one of them that I'm willing to admit is I'm very ignorant on the perspective of Islam and religious freedom. And I know that you have written a lot and are working within your faith community. And perhaps you could share with us and with your listeners kind of what you've been doing and the receptivity that people within the tradition, the Islamic tradition, have had to what you're teaching.
Well, it's interesting that the term religious freedom, you mentioned that people have different definitions and different understandings of what it means. The term religious freedom, if we're speaking more broadly in the Muslim world and specifically the Arabic-speaking world, the term translates to mean something along the lines of syncretism or free thinking in the negative sense. Therefore, there are many refutations that have been put out by Islamic scholars of this concept, where in reality it's kind of a straw man. They're actually arguing against something that religious freedom is actually not. So what I find is that Muslims often, especially those who don't live in the United States or in the Western world, Muslims outside of the Western world are surprised to find that when we say religious freedom, what we really mean is maximum space for religion in public and minimal interference by the government. And because governmental authorities in the Muslim world have essentially totally co-opted religion, and that means restrict it and control it. When they understand what we mean by religious freedom, then they like it. And then when it comes to treatment of minorities, this is a very important issue because there has been a drastic change in the Muslim world in terms of treatment of minorities with the shift from the imperial model where you had autonomous communities living under far-flung empires to the shift to the nation state, which has sort of resulted in an increase in the size of the state and therefore a greater oppression of not only Muslims who want to practice their religion but also non-Muslim minorities. Which is not to say that the situation of minorities was utopian or something similar to the United States under these different empires. For example, most recently the Ottoman Empire. But it is to say that in those, many people have observed correctly that at least in classical older Ottoman Empire, older Ottoman Empire, they allowed a certain level of autonomy for minorities. And not only that, there are many, many different resources within classical Islam that supports allowing a measure of religious freedom, not perhaps what we would consider sufficient today, and that those need to be developed further. But there are foundational sources within Islam that would support greater freedom for religious minorities.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I wonder how do you present your idea of religious freedom to a traditionalist
right.
or what a typical mindset? So
one of the very important errors that is that many Muslims are laboring under today in the Muslim world is that somehow or another it's Christians that are let's say a threat to the practice of Muslims, to the religious practice of Muslims. In reality, what I think, and we see this a lot in Pakistan, for example, where there's a great deal of persecution of Christian minorities by not just the government, really. In this case, it's the tail wagging the dog. And in the case of Pakistan, it's actually mobs that drive this persecution and that force the government.
Sweet Asia Bibi. Right?
As with Asia Bibi, I mean, government officials have been assassinated for trying to
defend her.
Defend her,
That's
and
right.
so now that's not to say that the entire population is doing this. It's a certain segment of the population, but this segment of the population somehow has identified Christians as being in opposition to Islam, but in reality, Christians in Pakistan are not agitating or pushing against Islam. In reality, it's the trend towards irreligion and secularism that is the actual problem. Which is not to say that there should be mobs against people who advocate for secularism, but what I like to do is I like to say that there's the Prophet Muhammad. He said. We are the people of the book. He was talking about himself, and it is upon the people of the book to help the people of the book. So the people of the book is a term meaning Muslims, Christians, and Jews.
That's right.
And so there's a principle that we should help those who are religious and who believe against attempts to infringe on that. And also another thing the Prophet said. The believers are the defenders of the places of worship of the people of the book, which is very much in contrast when you take that and you say, okay, well now in Pakistan they're rioting and burning down a church because there's a rumor that someone has insulted the Prophet. And so these are the type of resources where we need to go back and remind the Muslims and say, believers are allies of believers in religion. Are allies of one another in supporting a society where everyone can pursue their religion and all the good that comes from that, with the hospitals and the and the charity and the education. And as religion, we've seen in modernity and modern times, we've seen that as religion shrinks, the state increases. And then the state increases, the sphere of religion, and civil society shrinks. That's what we need to be aware of and concerned with, not Christians and rumors about someone insulting the prophet.
Ismail, you have taught me a lot just in this brief conversation, in part because I have kind of considered religious freedom in two separate spheres. International religious freedom and the horrors that we see on the news of persecution against religious minorities, and then my personal concern about the status of religion in the U.S. And it sounds from what you've been sharing, and hopefully, Tom, you can elaborate, there's a lot more in common in what we see in the Arab world and what we're seeing in these shocking violent, often, attacks against religious minorities and what we are facing in what oftentimes Pope Francis has called polite persecution. There's a common thread. Am I off? Have I understood a little bit of the root causes of some of the kind of discord that we have in promoting the idea of religious freedom and pluralism and the benefits of it?
Sure. I would add to that the root cause is a failure to understand the meaning of religious freedom. If you understand it, unless you're a terrorist or a totalitarian, you can intuitively see the value of it if you happen to be religious for your own religion, if you're not, for your society. And I think it's very important. This is why we take the approach of going to the root causes and working on them and not just responding to the mobs. We're informed by them, but we want to go to do the hard work of going to the root of the problem.
Let me remind our listeners that this is Conversations with Consequences of the Catholic Association, and we're speaking to two scholars from the Religious Freedom Institute. We're going to take a really fast break, and then we're going to come back and delve a little deeper. Welcome back, friends. You are listening to Conversations with Consequences, the radio show and podcast of the Catholic Association. I'm your hostess, Dr. Gracie Christie. I'm joined in studio today by my good friend and colleague, our legal eagle at the Catholic Association, Andrea Picciotti-Bear. And we have two distinguished guests with us, scholars from the Religious Freedom Institute. More than scholars. They are more than scholars.
Well, I've found this conversation incredibly interesting. I don't know about you so far.
I've learned so much. So on the last segment, to recap, we talked a little bit about the definition of religious freedom, both from a Christian and an Islamic perspective. And that was extremely interesting. And now I want to point out something, and I hope we can talk about this coming up. I've been to several of your conferences and your get-togethers that you have with the Religious Freedom Institute here in D.C., and I was struck by two things. By several things, but two primarily. Number one, the ecumenism of the gathering, the really astounding diversity of the people that are interested in this question, and the way that so many different faith traditions are being brought in to attack this problem of lack of religious freedom in whether it's American or outside or in between countries. But the second thing that made a big impression on me when I first heard it, and I've been mulling it over in my head ever since, is how you say that religious freedom, I'm quoting from your website, is an indispensable driver of democracy, social stability, civil liberty, economic prosperity, equality of women, and the defeat of violent extremism. And I find that way that you connect the dots between what is a human right, religious freedom, something that we all wish to experience because we are all people with consciences that want to adhere to the truth. And then you connect the dots to things that are very materially beneficial to any society. So maybe Miss Dr. Farr, you can tell us
Sure.
how you connect those dots and how that works.
Let me first, if I might, just do a brief response to your point about our ecumenism. I don't particularly like. I like diversity.
That's not a great word.
Diversity.
When I said it, first I couldn't pronounce it.
Yeah. Well, it has negative connotations. The
That's
point
right.
is we bring people from across the spectrum of America's religious and, frankly, internationally, across the spectrum of religious and political and ideological views. And I think one of the events you came to was our American Charter event, where we rolled out the American Charter of Freedom of Religion and Conscience at the National Archives. And that was an example of what you're talking about, because not only did we have all kinds of religious people, Muslims and Christians and Sikhs and Jews, and there's one of everything in America. We got a lot of those, but also deep political divisions. We had a former
that's right, I remember
a former president of the ACLU, Nadine Strawson, who signed the American Charter, and on the other side, Professor Robert George.
That's exactly right. I remember that. That was very impressive.
So, this was a restatement of the founding principles of America, and we got people on all sides to sign this. They don't agree about much, but they agreed about the preciousness of this right of free exercise of religion. On the issue of its impact, though, I mean, this has always fascinated me. And our predecessor, or our precursor organization, was at Georgetown University, where we did a lot of the scholarship. And probably why you think of us as scholars.
You look like scholars, too.
We are, but we left Georgetown.
It's the glasses.
In a good way.
Well, we want to take the scholarship and do something with it, and that's really what the Religious Freedom Institute is all about. So you read our mission statement, or from it, and we're convinced that the founders were right, that religious freedom has good impact on our society. They believed we would fail without it, without religion in public life. So we started with that, and then we spent probably a decade at Georgetown and since then proving that they were right by doing empirical studies, by looking into the relationship between religious freedom and economic freedom, looking into the relationship between religious freedom and the rights of women and of higher literacy, particularly among women, looking into this fascinating business of where religious freedom exists, you have less religion-related violence and religion-related terrorism. Now, if that's true, everybody ought to know more about that, right? We're working very hard to make sure that everyone knows about this. And, for example, with our own State Department, which is where I got my start in this issue, with the current Ambassador-at-Large for Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, who really does get this, and the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, gets it as well.
Well, and Tom, just the last 2 years have been incredible leadership by the administration in furtherance of international religious freedom, right? With the ministerials, perhaps you can mention kind of the great opening that the administration has shown to this important.
When he became Ambassador-at-Large for Religious Freedom, I guess, 2.5 years ago, there was a different Secretary of State at the time, Ambassador Brownback, and his staff got the idea of this ministerial, and that's just a name for bringing foreign ministers and their delegations from around the world to Washington. They happen from time to time. They're run by foreign ministers or secretaries of state in this case. And the only one that I'm aware of, that Secretary Pompeo, he's the one that agreed to do it, by the way. Brownback convinced Pompeo to do this. And he immediately said, yes, let's do it. So he had the first ministerial in last year in the summer and brought, I think, something like 80 or 85 delegations from around the world and about 400 leaders of civil society organizations around the world. They did it again this summer, and we reached over 100 foreign delegations. Most of them, many of them at least, including foreign ministers, came to D.C. for a 3-day summit headed by Secretary Pompeo, addressed by Vice President Pence, and run by Ambassador Brownback, plus about 1,000 this time. I mean, the State Department was
bursting.
You could hardly turn around, and it's the largest gathering they've ever had on human rights at the State Department, which is been there a long time. So this is big because it's building an international community for these fundamental rights. Where there is resistance, I mean, there's resistance here, but also around the world.
Well, and it used to be, and you were you a Foreign Service officer?
I sure was.
It used to be that Foreign Service officers kind of had the mindset of just don't touch religion. Wherever you are, deal with the economics, deal with the politics, deal with issues of humanitarian concerns, and don't touch religion. And for anyone of faith, religion touches upon everything.
That's right. Madeleine Albright wrote a book after she left after the Obama administration, or sorry, the Clinton administration. She was secretary under President Clinton. She wrote a book called The Mighty and the Almighty, and in it she said what you said. She said, we were trained as Foreign Service officers to stay away from religion. It's too much trouble. It's too problematic. It's un-American. And, of course, that's precisely, exquisitely wrong because the founders wanted religion, not religious violence, but religious motivations, which they believe was the basis of virtue. And it's not terribly complicated. They believed without a virtuous...
They rightly believed it.
They rightly believed that without a virtuous citizenry, we would fail as a republic. Remember, this was a great experiment in history, the American Revolution and the constitutional settlement. So we're now rediscovering this. A lot of our empirical evidence, I said it a minute ago, is to prove that the founders were right, that it leads to economic prosperity. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, said, come to Pennsylvania Colony. He was a Quaker.
That's right.
He said, come to Pennsylvania Colony. It's good for business. He hadn't read our studies back in the 1700s, but he intuitively understood this, and he was right. That's the real point. Pennsylvania Colony was bursting with economic activity, in part because religious freedom was there.
Tom, one of the things that I've appreciated about RFI, the Religious Freedom Institute, is that you're not just scholars, although you're strong scholars. You're not just wonks, although I think you're a
Define wonk, please.
People in Washington, sometimes we only talk to one another about politics and we forget the importance of whatever's being promoted for regular people. And I've always appreciated that among stakeholders in this conversation, you've reached out to church communities and that you've not only have representation in your scholarship of a wide range of faith traditions, but you've gone to church leadership. And I understand that, especially in dealing with a lot of tense environments where a lack of religious freedom has led to violence, you've reached out to the religious leadership in those countries. And maybe, Ismail, you could speak a little bit about the importance of the faith communities in promoting religious freedom.
If we don't have religious communities on board with the notion of religious freedom, then it's never going to be achieved.
It'll fail.
There's a very serious mistaken approach of believing that the hope for religious freedom let's talk about them in the Muslim world, for non-Muslim minorities for non-Muslim minorities in the Muslim world lies in secularism, lies in the abandonment of, or the hope that Muslims will abandon their faith. But in reality, number one, that's probably not going to happen, so it's not realistic. But the second thing is that the resources are there in Islam. The foundation is there for a religious argument, a transcendent argument for religious freedom, or at least what I like to say, the substantive principles of religious freedom. I say that to clarify that we're not talking. We don't need the label religious freedom. What we need is what is the reality the reality that label describes. And so, it's the fruit will be born. Much more fruit will be born by dialogue and persuasion of the religious communities that persecution or limitation, undue limitation of religion is contrary to what God intends. And so, for example, in the Quran it says, "O you who believe, respond when God calls you to that which gives you life." So that which gives you life is what we understand to mean God's commandments on how we are supposed to believe in Him and worship Him, and also how we're supposed to treat our fellow human being. That's what creates. It's not a coincidence that when we follow God's commandments and how we're supposed to treat one another, for example, treating one another as if as we would like to be treated ourselves. which is one of the commandments that we were required to obey by the Prophet Muhammad, or giving charity, or and all these things. So when we follow those things, it's no coincidence that we prosper, that human beings flourish. And appealing to those religious arguments is what is going to win the day, not in attempting to push religion out of the public sphere.
If I could just add to that, what Ismail has said, here's an example of taking his ideas and translating them into action. We have begun for the last 2 or 3 years a private consultation, not the kinds of conferences that you were talking about, Gracie, but places where we go for 3 or 4 days quietly with Muslim stakeholders from the Middle East, which means religious and political figures, but primarily religious figures, to begin a conversation about this. I emphasize it's not a conference because this is not going to be solved by, a group of eggheads sitting around in panels reading papers. We're having honest conversation about this, and we're going to the question of violence and Islamist terrorism and the things that are probably on the minds of Catholics as they listen to Ismail speak. We have very, very honest discussions about this, but we treat them as we want to be treated, to pick up on what Ismail was saying, with respect. I view my fellow Muslims, and frankly every human being that doesn't give me a reason to believe otherwise, that they are truth seekers because they're human. Mm-hmm. And
it's
they
built
are
into our DNA,
Catholic,
right?
Exactly,
to seek God.
That's a lovely way to say it. Truth seekers.
Precisely so. And I mean, this is because I'm a Catholic that I believe this, and Ismail believes it because he's a Muslim.
And you believe it because it's true. Because
it's true. And so you can be honest. And we've had some rough sessions where we really, really disagreed with each other. But what we've done, we've now had 2 of these several-day conferences, is begin to develop what I would call community, which isn't a group of people that believe in that none of this matters, or that this is syncretism, or that we can have the Abrahamic religions. Neither one of us particularly like that because it's just an idea that we really are all the same.
Yeah.
We're not the same. We have deep differences, but it's because of that, not in spite of that, that we can talk about religious freedom. So our ultimate goal is to find out whether religious freedom, as we mean it, translate it if you like. I don't care how you translate it, but the principles, as Ismail says, are very important. And I'm very, very optimistic. I don't want to say confident. That sounds arrogant. But I'm optimistic that this process we began a few years ago is now beginning to bear fruit.
And what's unique about what we're doing is that we're not this is not an attempt to persuade non-Muslims that Islam is a great religion. Or so. We don't actually do a lot of that. What we do is talk to Muslims and persuade Muslims that Islam is a great religion. In the sense that we persuade them that we're better than this. And so we have our next conference is coming up in Sarajevo. We're going to bring together some of the finest and most influential minds in the Muslim world. And we're not going to the secular, irreligious people. We're going to the very, very firm and, in their faith. And these are why are we going to them? Because these are the ones that we need to have this conversation with, and these are the ones who have huge influence, hundreds of people going to their mosques, literally millions following them on social media. These are the people that we need to persuade. We don't want to get a bunch of people together who are all already on the same page, or who are just going to say what they think we want them to say.
I was really struck in some of our conversation talking about the history, especially in the U.S., in support and in advancing religious freedom. And I wonder if the rise of secularism and the cabining of religious expression in the last decades or so has changed some of that, and if perhaps you guys, are, in addition to working abroad, are working domestically. I don't know how you do it. You're like trilocating. But maybe Tom or Ismail, you can speak a little bit about the need to teach about the importance of faith and religious freedom here in the U.S.
Well, the way we're able to do it all is because the approach is the same for everybody. The beginning is that religious freedom is for everybody. It's not just for Americans. I'm convinced that the founders meant that, although a lot of people would argue with me they were doing something else. So the way we do it in America is to try to do what we're doing in a different way with the Middle Eastern Muslims in what we just discussed. We're trying to give fact-based arguments about the value of religious freedom, and we're doing it through something called the Center for Religious Freedom Education and our North American Action Team. Those are the two parts of the RFI, the Religious Freedom Institute, that are doing this. The Center for Religious Freedom Education is developing curricula, which is now being piloted. Curricula are now being piloted in high schools around the country.
Fabulous.
At this point,
Wow.
Mainly either Catholic or Catholic-oriented classical schools. But we have a couple of curricula. One is based on this American Charter, which we're developing for public schools, but the one we're doing now is called America's First Freedom Curriculum. And just the title of it tells you where we're going with this. It's for everybody. It's free exercise equality. Free exercise equality. That's our phrase for it. So we're getting that in the high schools. We're offering training for high school teachers and so forth. We're also doing this at the university level. So I taught at Georgetown for many years. We have my approaches that we use. We offer to colleges. My colleague Tim Shaw taught there as well. We have his courses. And we're developing memoranda of understandings, MOU, with various colleges. We have one with Baylor, which is the largest and oldest Baptist institution. We have one with Catholic University. We're developing one with Biola in Los Angeles, and many, many others, where we offer not only syllabuses or syllabi, if you're an egghead.
You are.
But no, I'm not. And but we also offer training for professors, and we offer the professors themselves. So get it back into the schools. That's one of the many things we're doing.
I love that because I have children, of some young adult children and younger children, and there is a complete lack of understanding of the importance of religious liberty. When you think about promoting religious freedom in the United States, how do you think about secularists? Liberals and secularists have, in a sense, their own religion, right? It's
No, they don't. I'm glad you said
It should not be protected.
Okay, please correct me.
Let me give you the quick answer to that. Religious freedom protects secularists in the sense that it does not, it's that immunity from coercion. Nobody can be coerced to believe that which their conscience will not allow them to believe, and that includes non-believers. But beyond that, the American system protects the secularists not with the free exercise of religion. That renders the meaning of religion nonsense, in my opinion. They get to say whatever
Free
they want by
association
free
rights
association,
and press.
freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We have a particular thing called religion in this country, and we protect that. The founders wanted that, but not just Christianity. I have to say it again, all religions equally. So it's very important. We're not talking about anti-secularists or anti-atheists. Frankly, I believe that at the end of the day, if our crowd got back involved in the free exercise of religion, it would benefit this country, and therefore it would benefit everybody.
So you don't agree with people who say that environmentalism is a kind of religion, and it has, or other kinds of.
It's got attributes, but
it has
it's not a
some
religion.
Well, right. I think when I try
There's
to
a fervor,
explain,
the
I know
paper
a lot
straw.
I know a lot of secular, very intensely secular people, and I try to explain to them. And now I know I'm wrong, but I can explain to them. I explain to them. You feel very strongly. You have your conscience very invested in certain things.
Sure.
Maybe it's paper straws.
I get that, but that's protected in our system.
Without having to go into the religious freedom
arena. If you say
arena.
that's religion, then what isn't religion?
Oh no, I'm
We
with
once
you.
had this position presented at one of our events at Georgetown with Michael McConnell and Noah Feldman, Stanford and Harvard Law.
See, I'm not so off.
That's right. And Noah Feldman said, I believe environmentalism is a religion. It has a liturgy.
And Stanford won.
Well, in my view, it does. It won. But this is a big debate. I just don't like it because if you say environmentalism, what philosophy is religion, side straddle hops are
vegetarianism.
Vegetarianism.
Well, and let me just clarify.
You get to do all that, but not under the banner of religious freedom.
I was having a conversation recently with someone who said, well, we don't want to protect the Satanists. And I don't think anyone who has been defending religious freedom has recognized Satanism either as a religion, even though it has many attributes that look like a religion, at least domestically.
Some courts have specifically addressed this and said that it's not a religion because it doesn't actually make any claims about the deeper meanings of life and the transcendent. So the courts have a very interesting, you being an attorney, the courts have a very interesting way of analyzing what's a religion and what's not. But at the same time, and there is a sense, and I mean there's a rhetorical sense where you can say, well, an atheist asserts something on the basis of the faith that there is no, that there is no God, for example, because you can't prove, that's not something that you can prove. It's something that you believe because that's, that's your belief. And
so we can bring it back to what Tom had said early on, is that freedom of religion does have some boundaries, that the state can put some boundaries, especially when there are issues of order and the safety of others, and anything that's going to kind of be a challenge. And maybe that might be an opportunity to kind of close it out. How do we make sure that this isn't a horse running without a rider? How do we make sure that not only in protecting the right of the human to seek truth and to find a personal relationship with God, you don't use religious freedom as an excuse to harm? Because that's the argument that's being presented as in opposition.
That's what the other side says, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is a democracy, which is supposed to be decided by the people, not by the courts, which is why we are not involved. We do amicus briefs, but we are not litigators. We're focusing on the culture and on the founders. And so the answer to the question, in my view, is that all of us is free exercise equality. So we have a right, and I would argue a duty, to be citizens of this country. Take what you learn in your conscience and in your house of worship and bring it into our culture. Make arguments about public policy. Make arguments to your friends in your profession about what our laws and public policies ought to be. You can't argue for violence. You cannot argue to
or to
put
suppress
it at
or
disadvantage.
silence.
That's right. To put women at a disadvantage. We do have laws and norms and you can't argue for a monopoly. You can't argue that we have to pass a law that says everybody has to come to our church. That, by the way, has been tried. It's a very, very bad idea. It is a very bad idea. Here's the answer. Exercise your religion. Mm-hmm. Exercise your religion. It doesn't matter what your religion is. Within the limits established by our culture and our traditions. Don't go into a fetal position. Don't just go to your mass or your synagogue, but come into the public square and make arguments about who we ought to be as a country.
Well, those are words to close on, because I can't imagine better advice for our listeners. Thank you so much, Tom Farr and Ismail Royer, for joining us today for a fascinating conversation. I wish we could talk for 2 more hours. Can you tell our listeners, please, how they can learn more about the RFI?
Go to religiousfreedominstitute.org, is that right? Or
rfi.org. Now we just bought that domain, so.
Oh, good.
Okay. That's easier, rfi.org.
rfi.org, religiousfreedom.org. Read about our action teams and what we're doing.
Well, you're doing fabulous work. Thank you again for joining us.
It was great. Thank you guys for coming.
Every morning, the Catholic Association reviews all the latest news and sends our subscribers a carefully curated collection of the most important news of the day. Items are specifically selected for a smart Catholic audience like you. Don't let the world take you by surprise. Subscribe to our daily media roundup at thecatholicassociation.org. This week, as is customary, Father Roger Landry gives us a short but brilliant homily on this coming Sunday's Gospel. Please stay tuned for Father Landry, and do look up his daily homily written in audio on his website, catholicpreaching.com.
This is Father Roger Landry, and it's a joy to have a chance to ponder with you the consequential conversation the Lord Jesus wants to have with us this Sunday. It's a conversation that Jesus introduces with perhaps the most haunting question in the whole gospel. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? The question seems to be more than rhetorical. Jesus asks it seems, because he's not convinced that when he comes, he's going to find the type of faith he wants to see. The test of faith, he indicates by the parable of the persistent widow, is whether when he comes, he'll find us persevering in prayer. Prayer, after all, is faith in action. If Jesus is going to find us faithful, he's going to find us praying. Obviously not necessarily on our knees, but seeking to unite our whole day and life, our mind, heart, soul, and strength to God. If he doesn't find us praying and living in conscious communion with him, however, it's likely he's not going to find us living by faith. And so through the gospel parable, Jesus wants to teach us about the necessity of praying always without growing weary. He wants to help us to learn how to cry out to God day and night. He wants to train us to live that way, so that no matter what time he comes, we will be united to the Lord in a prayer not merely of our lips, but of our lives. So Jesus asks the haunting question, because he knows many do not pray like the importune woman. Many Catholics don't persevere in prayer. We're content on praying a little, saying a Hail Mary or two at the beginning of the day or at the end. Others would like to pray more, but they think they don't have the time, because they're prioritizing so many other things in life to a life-changing dialogue with God. Others, because of a bad experience, stop praying altogether as an ordinary activity of life, only turning to God in times of crisis. This Sunday, Jesus will speak to all of us about the persevering faith he wishes to find in our prayer, hoping to open us up to receive his graces precisely so that we can pray in that way. But we have to ask a prior question. Why does Jesus want us to pray with the type of heroic perseverance he describes? It's not that he wants to hog all our attention. It's not that he wants us to ask for something 70 times, 7 times is a pointless exercise, especially given that God already knows what we need before we ask. The reason is because we live as we pray. In order to help us to learn how to persevere faithfully in life, he wants us to learn first to persevere faithfully in prayer. We'll see in this Sunday's reading that when Moses' arms were lifted in prayer, the Israelites had the upper hand against the Amalekites. But when his hands fell because of fatigue, the Amalekites prevailed. Likewise, when we persevere in prayer, then we open ourselves to receive God's strength to confront and overcome the challenges we face each day. When our hearts, however, grow weary and our hands fall, when we either try to do things on our own or lose heart and give up the good fight of faith altogether, that's when we fall. To persevere faithfully in life, we must learn how to persevere faithfully in prayer. Jesus tells us in the gospel this Sunday, he who endures to the end will be saved. Life is a marathon, but one in which God wants to run alongside of us, helping and sustaining us along the way. Prayer is the consequential conversation we have along that marathon. Just like a marathon runner, if we're ever going to finish the race to the heavenly Jerusalem, we have to train. We can't go from barely praying to praying always overnight. We need to make a commitment in spirit, but then train our weak flesh. We must grow in prayer. That begins with making the commitment to set aside some fixed time for a one-on-one appointment with the Lord each day, in which we spend time quietly listening to him, speaking to us as we respond to him with faith. The key is to make that appointment and treasure it. It's the most important appointment of our day. The Mass is the great persevering prayer of the Church. It began during the Last Supper, continued on Good Friday, and has continued all the way to the present day. It's one continuous sacrifice, as the third Eucharistic prayer has it, from the rising of the sun to its setting. But it's important that we persevere in praying the Mass and living a Eucharistic life. We should hope that the vast majority of times we come to Mass, it won't be a feat of perseverance, but rather a joy in the highlight of our day and week. But on those occasions in which we're impatient at Mass, it's an opportunity for us to learn how to persevere in prayer and life. So when the Son of Man comes, as Jesus asked, will he find faith on earth? This Sunday is a grace-filled opportunity for us to recognize that God will give us all the help we need to respond to him. He will give us the grace to increase our prayer, to persevere in our prayerful union with him, so that we may persevere in the good fight against evil and for him. We ask the Lord for his help to pray with living faith, so that when he comes on Sunday, he may find us full of faith, ready to persevere in prayerful union with him through the valleys and mountains of life, all the way until, God willing, we join the eternally persevering prayer of the Church Triumphant. God bless you all.
Thank you, Father Landry, to another fascinating homily. Unfortunately, it's time to say goodbye. You've been listening to Conversations with Consequences, a service of the Catholic Association. I'm your hostess, Gracie Christie, joined today by my colleague, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, and two very interesting guests from the Religious Freedom Institute, Tom Farr and Ismail Royer.
Gracie, I think that this was an incredibly fascinating and engaging conversation. I'm so happy about it. I've been really trying to convince and explain, especially to good, coherent Catholics, the importance of religious freedom, both here in the U.S. and abroad. And it struck to me, I was reading recently one of the new books out by George Weigel, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, and he highlights a quote from Pope Benedict, and Pope Benedict said, "God wishes to be adored by people who are free."
Oh, I love that. That's perfect. Well, and and I think I would like to repeat what Tom Farr said at the end of the segment, is the best way to defend our religious freedom is to go out and exercise it.
Absolutely. Amen, sister.
Well, thank you, listeners, for joining us this week. If you've been listening on the radio, you've been listening on the Guadalupe Radio Network at 11 a.m. on Fridays. If not, you've been listening to the podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast of our show wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can go to thecatholicassociation.org to subscribe for free and also to sign up for our TCA Clips daily email. Tell your friends about us, and we'll see you next week.